On the 1st of February 1917, Germany went back to unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant the U-boats would now sink without warning any merchant ships sailing for England. They calculated that if they sank around 600,000 tons of shipping a month, Britain, which imported over 60% of its food and the wheat for 4 loaves of bread out of every 5, would be out of the war inside about 5 months. And for a while, it was working. In April 1917 alone, the U-boats sank about 860,000 tons. The Admiralty ran those losses against the rate at which new ships could be built and concluded that unless the German submarine bases on the Belgian coast were taken, it was, quote, improbable that we could go on with the war next year. Here's the problem with that, though. The first experimental convoys sailed in May and came in almost untouched, and the losses came down off the April peak from there. So by the time the infantry climbed out of the trenches on the 31st of July and ran straight into the worst horrors of this war, the emergency that justified sending them was already being solved by a change in the way ships sailed. The other big thing that made this battle happen is that the French army had mutinied. After severe casualties and a war that had dragged on far longer than anyone thought possible, the soldiers protested and stayed in their trenches, still willing to defend them, but not willing to go into pointless, costly attacks anymore. This spread through roughly half the French infantry divisions on the Western Front, while at the other end of Europe, Russia was going the same way. The British could see what that meant. If Russia dropped out, every German division standing in the east would be free to come west the following year. The Americans had declared war back in April, but they had almost nobody in France yet, which left the British as the only army on the Western Front still in a condition to attack and perhaps change something before it was too late. So that is why somebody had to attack. Now, the ground they picked to do it on. The Vale of Ypres was farmland before the war. Underneath a thin skin of sand and silt sits clay, and the water table lies close to the surface even in high summer. The fields were kept workable by a system of streams and ditches that had been maintained for centuries, because once you stop maintaining it, the water has nowhere to go and the land goes back to marsh. Ypres sits about 20 meters above sea level, and Passchendaele at the far end of it is at 50. That is the commanding height. 30 meters of rise spread over 5 miles. On ground this flat, though, that is everything, because from up there you can see every road, every gun position, and every man moving in the bowl below, and the Germans had been sitting on it looking down into Ypres since 1914. Now, before the main attack, there was one piece of the plan that worked. To break out east of Ypres at all, the British first had to take the Messines ridge to the south, because for as long as the Germans held it, they could see along the flank of any attack and fire into it. Miners had been digging under the German lines there since 1915, and German miners were digging back at them, trying to bring the tunnels down. Then, on the 24th of May, 1917, the German officer in charge of mining there reported that the danger of a British mine attack had been dealt with, and that there is no danger from it. However, 2 weeks later, at 3:10 in the morning on the 7th of June, 19 mines went off along the ridge at once, and the ridge was taken in about 3 hours. Plumer, the commander of the Second Army, had just taken the ridge and wanted to keep going while the Germans opposite were still reeling. Haig, the commander-in-chief in France, said no because the main attack was set for the end of July. So 7.5 weeks went past, and the Germans spent every one of those days getting ready. Instead of a continuous trench line waiting to be smashed by artillery, the forward zone became a scatter of small concrete blockhouses, which the British nicknamed pillboxes. Walls a meter or two thick, each held by a handful of men, and sighted so that they covered one another. The wire was laid not to stop men but to steer them, funneling them into lanes the machine guns were already laid on. And well back, out of sight behind the ridge, sat the guns and the Eingreif divisions, whose job was to sit out of the fight until the British took a piece of ground, and then arrive and take it back off them before they could dig in. The whole thing was designed on the assumption that the attacker would get in, and built around what happened to him next. And after Messines, nobody on the German side had to guess where the blow was going to fall. On the night of the 12th of July 1917, 19 days before the attack was due to go in, the German guns fired a new shell into the British positions around Ypres, marked with a yellow cross. About 50,000 of them came over that night, carrying roughly 125 tons of what came to be called mustard gas. It worked differently from the gases the British already knew about. Chlorine and phosgene were clouds, so they blew across, they injured or killed whoever they caught, and once the wind had taken them away, the ground was safe to use again. Mustard was an oily liquid, and when the shell burst, it sprayed that liquid across the ground and over everything standing on it, and then it stayed there. That was the point of it. Since the Germans were using it to poison ground, they had no intention of attacking across, and to keep it unusable for days at a time. The men in the target area didn't know they'd been hit, because the shells came down with a soft plop, rather than a bang, and mustard doesn't hurt on contact. There was a bit of irritation in the nose and some sneezing, and that was all, so men took their masks off again and sat down on ground that was covered in it. The mask wouldn't have helped them much anyway, since it protected the eyes and the lungs, while mustard goes through uniform cloth and burns the skin underneath it. The damage only became obvious an hour or two later. The eyes burned and swelled, men were vomiting, and the skin turned red and then blistered, worst of all wherever a man had been sweating, so the armpits, the buttocks, and the genitals. It did the same thing to the throat and the airway in the men who had breathed the vapor, stripping out the lining, and that turned into bronchitis and then pneumonia, which is what killed most of the ones who died. The eye injuries swelled the lids shut, so casualties arrived at the clearing stations blind, walking in a file with each man's hand on the shoulder of the man in front, and an orderly leading them. On the 13th and 14th of July, 4 casualty clearing stations behind Ypres took in over 2,100 men between them, and 95 of those died. Over the following 3 weeks, around 14,000 British soldiers were admitted because of mustard, and close to 8,000 of them came from 5th Army, which was the army due to make the attack. That's more gas casualties in 3 weeks than the British had taken from gas shelling in the whole of the previous year. There was no treatment for it, because nothing reverses the damage once the liquid has been absorbed. All anyone could do was get the contaminated uniform off the man, wash him down, put clean clothing on him, and then wait for the burns to heal, and that took about 46 days on average. More than 3/4 of them had to be moved further back to the base hospitals, so each of these men was out of the war for something like a month and a half. And the ground stayed dangerous long after the shelling stopped. Sunlight evaporated the liquid, so a position that seemed harmless in the dark could turn dangerous at sunrise. Once the ground started giving off vapor, and in cold weather it could sit in the soil for weeks, and then poison whoever disturbed it. None of this stopped the offensive, because by then, the British had assembled the largest concentration of artillery they'd ever put in one place behind Ypres, and it had already started firing. The bombardment had started on the 16th of July, and it went on for a fortnight. They fired around 4.25 million shells from roughly 3,000 guns along an 18-kilometer front, which is about 1 gun for every 6 yards, and more ammunition than the British had ever put into a single preparation. It was meant to do 2 things: cut the German wire and break the concrete. It cut a lot of the wire, but it barely touched the concrete, because concrete that thick will survive anything except a direct hit from a heavy howitzer, and to land a shell right on top of something that small, you have to be able to see it and correct your fire. The Germans held the high ground, so British observation over that battlefield was poor, and a great many of those shells came down on empty ground. Meanwhile, the German guns were firing high explosive and mustard back at the British batteries, and those crews couldn't be rested because the firing program had to keep running to schedule. So after 2 weeks, the German defense was still standing. The attack went in at 10 to 4 in the morning on the 31st of July in the dark, under low, unbroken cloud. In the north, the Guards and the French pushed 3,000 yards and more, and the French did it for about 1,300 casualties, partly because they had very heavy artillery behind them, and partly because they were attacking where the German positions were thinnest. In the center, it went further still, about 4,000 yards, right through the German third position. In the south, on the Gallowelt Plateau, the advance got roughly 1,000 yards and then stopped. German artillery observers up on that plateau could see right across the British half of the battlefield, so for as long as the Germans held it, every attack the British made afterwards was made under fire from guns that were being aimed by men who could see what they were shooting at. The 5th Army took roughly 18 square miles that day and over 5,500 prisoners. The 31st and the 3 days after it cost about 27,000 casualties in the 5th Army alone, and nearly 3,700 of those men were dead, and the 2nd Army lost another 4,800. On the 4th of August, by which point it had been raining for 4 days, Haig reported to the cabinet that the attack had been a success and that the losses were light for a battle of that size. Late that first morning, regiments of 2 German divisions came up over the Passchendaele ridge and started walking towards the fighting. These were the divisions that had been kept out of the battle for exactly this. At 2 in the afternoon, their own creeping barrage opened along the stretch of front where the British had gone deepest. 6 waves of German infantry came over the Zonnebecker spur behind it, and their aircraft came down low over the British to bomb them them and shoot them up. The 3 British brigades furthest forward had been fighting since before dawn. They were thinned out and spread across ground they'd only just taken, and the rain had come down, so their own artillery observers couldn't see far enough to bring fire where it was needed. They were driven back off everything they'd gained, all the way to the line they'd captured first thing that morning, and by the time they got there, those 3 brigades had lost 70% of their men. So most of the men lost that day were lost after the advance was over, in the hours they spent trying to hold on to what they'd taken, and they would have to take that same ground all over again later. The rain that started that afternoon didn't stop for 4 days. August was one of the wettest in 75 years. With the drains gone, the shell holes filled up, and then they joined together, and a landscape that had already been shelled into overlapping craters turned into a shallow lake with a few lumps of solid ground left in it. You couldn't dig a trench, and you couldn't walk in a straight line because there was nothing solid to walk on. This is the picture everybody has of Passchendaele. They moved across that ground on duckboard tracks 2 planks wide. A man who slipped off a duckboard carrying 60 pounds of kit didn't always come back up, and getting him out took 2 or 3 others hauling him by the arms, if they could reach him at all. And there was a standing order across the British Army that men weren't to stop and help the wounded during an advance, because if an attack stops to carry its casualties, then half its rifles have stopped going forward. So a man who'd been hit crawled into a shell hole, which was the sensible thing to do since a shell hole is cover. Then the water in it rose, and the sides of it were liquid, and he couldn't climb out. There's an account of this. A sergeant of the rifle brigade heard screaming coming out of a crater and found a man in it, already sunk to his shoulders. They laid their rifles out end to end to make a chain for him to grab hold of, and it still wasn't long enough to reach him. He asked them to shoot him, but none of them could do it, so they stayed there with him and watched him go under. And there were men in a captured pillbox one night who could hear the men outside sinking the same way. They spent the whole night lifting duckboards and pushing them out into the mud, trying to give those men something solid to rest on so they'd stop going down. That mud was also full of bacteria because these fields had been farmed since the Middle Ages, and the farmers had been spreading manure on them the whole time, both animal and human. Manure carries bacteria that live without oxygen, and their spores can sit in the soil for decades. One of them gives you tetanus and the other gives you gas gangrene. So when the shelling turned all that soil over and threw it up into the air, it was coming down on men who were living in it, sleeping in it, and caked in it up to the waist. The infection usually came off a man's own clothing. When a shell fragment goes through him, it drags his filthy uniform into the wound along with the dirt and the metal. So now there's contaminated cloth sitting deep inside his leg, in a pocket of dead tissue that has no blood supply, so no oxygen reaches it, and no white blood cells reach it either. That's exactly what those bacteria need. They multiply in the dead muscle. They produce toxins that kill the tissue around them, and they produce gas that forces its way along the muscle and opens a path for the infection to spread further. And all of that can happen within a few hours. There were no antibiotics, so the only treatment was to cut it out. You take out every scrap of dead tissue until you reach muscle that still bleeds, you get the cloth and the metal out, and then you leave the wound open, because stitching it closed is how you build the airless pocket the bacteria want in the first place. Even done properly in a hospital, about a quarter of gas gangrene cases still died. The German army alone lost around 100,000 men to it, and all of that depended on getting a man to a surgeon within a few hours, while the dead tissue could still be cut out before the infection had gone through it. The soil here was no different from anywhere else on the Western Front, since that same manured farmland runs across Belgium and northern France, and the Somme was fought on the same dirt. At Ypres, though, it now took far longer to carry a wounded man off the battlefield. A stretcher is built for 2 men to carry. In normal conditions on the Western Front, they used 4, so the bearers could swap over and rest. On this ground, it took 6, and in the worst of it, 8. The bearers were sinking as well, and one morning, a party of pioneers had to be sent up with ropes to pull bogged stretcher bearers out of the mud. 4 men carrying a stretcher 3 miles back took about 4 hours, and one party needed 10 hours to move a single wounded man a quarter of a mile. A battalion had 16 stretcher bearers for about 1,000 men, and they carried the wounded out along the same 2 planks that the ammunition and the rations and the reinforcements were coming up on. And later in the battle, a New Zealand private wrote home about what they found when they went forward over ground where an earlier attack had failed. They found British wounded still lying where they'd gone down, in the mud and the rain, for 4 days and 4 nights. The ones still alive had stayed alive by taking the rations and the water bottles off the dead men around them. The army understood this perfectly well, and in July 1917 it tried to do something about it. They pushed 3 casualty clearing stations right forward to a railway siding at Brandhoek, a few miles behind the front, and made them a specialist centre for stomach and chest wounds, so a man hit in the belly could be operated on quickly instead of being carried all the way back. The sister in charge of one of them, Kate Luard, called it an experiment in life-saving. The trouble is that a few miles behind the front at Ypres is still well inside the range of the German heavy guns, and this particular spot had railway sidings and ammunition dumps beside it, which is exactly what artillery aims at. So they were shelled repeatedly through August, and the surgery had to be moved back out of range again, which put it further away from the wounded. By 1917, the clearing stations around Ypres were giving men blood as standard, using portable kits made for the job, and the blood was typed and cross-matched properly. They were putting it into men who were bleeding out and going into shock, men who a year or two earlier would have been left aside as beyond saving. They couldn't keep blood ready in advance yet though. The first stored blood came weeks later at Cambrai in November in a different battle. So at Ypres, they could give a man blood, but only if there was somebody standing there to take it from. That's what happened to the men who were hit. The ones who weren't had to go on living out there, and the first thing they ran short of was water. A man in the line carried one water bottle, and when that was empty, he waited. Everything he drank after that had to be carried up to him from behind, along those same 2 planks at night under shell fire. It came up in petrol tins, because that's what the army had in quantity, so it arrived tasting of petrol no matter how the tin had been rinsed. And if the party carrying it was caught on the way, which happened, then nothing arrived and the men waited for the next one. There was water lying all around them, and you already know what was in there, since the mustard sat in those shell holes for days, and the dead were lying in them as well. However, the thirst got bad enough that men drank out of them anyway. There was plenty out there for the rats to eat, so they got fat and began biting even the men still alive. Practically every man had lice living in the seams of his uniform, and they carried trench fever. By 1917, the British had largely beaten trench foot, and one of the ways they beat it was a rule that no man should be left standing in a waterlogged sector for longer than a day and a half. But that rule assumed a front with trenches and support lines and somewhere dry to send a man back to. Here there were shell holes, and men sat in them for days, because there was nothing else to sit in, and standing in cold water that long makes the circulation in a foot give up. It goes numb first, so the men often felt nothing, even when the toes were already dead. They only found out when they came out and warmed up after it was already too late. Once the roads east of Ypres broke up, the horses and mules were the only way of getting shells anywhere near the guns. The poor animals would go into a flooded crater and drown in it, still in harness attached to the load. Getting one out meant men with ropes working in the open under shell fire if there was time, and often there wasn't. The ones that couldn't be got out were shot, and the columns went up the same tracks the next night anyway, past the animals from the night before, because the guns needed shells and there was no other way to move them. Then there's getting a message across that ground. The army ran on buried telephone and telegraph cable, and you can't bury cable in a swamp, so once the ground went, the line was cut faster than it could be repaired. That left runners, men carrying paper across open ground through artillery, snipers and machine guns, and they were getting killed, so they went back to using pigeons. They carried about 1/3 of all messages during the whole battle. Dogs were also used when the weather was bad and pigeons couldn't fly, but often the headquarters in the rear were looking at their maps with no idea what was happening up at the front, since nobody could get a message through. The last part of August and then September came in dry, and the ground firmed up enough to drag the heavy guns forward. And Haig now took the main effort off Gough and handed it to Plumer after all, 2 months later than he could have. Plumer didn't try to break through. He picked a small piece of the German line, hit it with everything he had, and sent the infantry no more than about 1,500 yards into it. Then they stopped and dug in where they stood, and a fresh wave came through them to take the next slice. After that, the guns were brought forward and the whole thing was done again. They called it bite and hold. The point of it was that the infantry never went further than its own artillery could cover, so when the German counterattack came, like it always came, it ran into men who were dug in and properly supported rather than an exhausted line at the end of its advance. It worked, and on the 20th of September at Messines Road, and again on the 26th at Polygon Wood, the British and Australians took what they went for and then held it against everything sent back at them. Messines Road cost about 5,000 Australian casualties. At Polygon Wood, the Australian 5th Division lost somewhere between 3,000 and 5,500 men. The reason it cost that much is what the infantry had to do to take the ground, because the artillery couldn't destroy a pillbox, so men had to walk up to it. Small parties worked round to the sides and the back, clearing the machine gun posts on the flanks with bombs and bayonets as they went. A Lewis gunner fired at the slit to keep the German machine gunner's head away from his sights. Then somebody ran the last few yards up against the wall and tried to stick a bomb through the slit the machine gun was firing out of. Once a pillbox was surrounded, it usually surrendered, and that was the most dangerous moment. In a fight like that, some of the garrison would decide they'd had enough while others kept firing, and neither group could tell the other what it had decided. That's what happened on the 20th of September. The Germans on the lower floor of a 2-story pillbox surrendered, and then a shot came down from the upper floor, fired by men who didn't know, and it killed an Australian. The men standing around the pillbox took it for treachery and bayoneted every prisoner they had just taken. And then there's what happened to the men who broke down out there, because plenty of them did, and the army had no room in its thinking for a man whose nerve had gone. It didn't count that as a wound, it counted it as a crime. So a man who couldn't make himself go forward anymore was tried for it, and some of them were shot. A few miles behind this same battlefield, battlefield in a courtyard behind the town hall at Pupperingi. Sergeant John Wall of the Worcestershires, a regular soldier since 1912, shot on the 6th of September for refusing to take his men up. Private Herbert Morris of the British West Indies Regiment, shot on the 20th, 17 years old. And in that same month it came out somewhere else too, at Etals, the base camp where the replacements for this battle were being trained, when a military policeman shot a corporal dead in the street and the whole camp turned on the police. It took 3 days and an armed force brought in from outside to put it back down, and the men who'd broken out were sent up to the front. On the 4th of October, 12 divisions attacked Broodseinde Ridge. The Germans had planned their own attack for the same morning on the same ground, so their barrage came down while the Australians were still packed into their jumping-off positions waiting to go, and roughly 1 man in 7 of the Australians going forward that morning was hit before the attack started. They took the ridge anyway. 5,000 prisoners were sent back down the line, and the German official history called the 4th of October a black day for their army. It shook their command enough that they began planning a withdrawal, and that withdrawal would have meant giving up the Belgian coast, which was the thing the whole offensive had been argued for in the first place. The day cost nearly 1,300 Australians killed and about 6,500 casualties in total, and the Australian 3rd Division took over 3,000 of those inside 24 hours. By the end of the month, October 1917 had cost close to 20,000 Australians, which makes it the bloodiest month in that country's military history. The rain started falling again on the 7th and 8th of October, and it took away the one thing that had been making Plumer's method work. The guns couldn't be pulled forward, and the ones already forward struggled to work because a field gun needs a firm platform, and after a few rounds the recoil drove it down into the mud, so the crew had to dig it out and lay it again before firing. That same creeping barrage which had walked the infantry onto their objectives in September now fell short or fell wide or was swallowed by mud that absorbed the blast. The wire in front of Passchendaele Ridge wasn't cut, and the weather had handed the advantage straight back to the Germans, since they were falling back onto ground that hadn't been churned up, while the British had to drag everything forward across the part that had. So the bigger withdrawal they'd started planning after Broodseinde, the one that would have given up the coast, was never made. And the men went forward into it anyway on the 9th. The Australian 2nd Division took its first objective and was driven all the way back to where it had started for 1,200 casualties. The day cost around 12,000 across the front, and the Germans still held the approaches to the ridge. A company of tanks was sent up the road from St. Julien to Polkapelle the same day, because that strip of old cobbled highway was the only surface left in the sector that would carry their weight, and every German gunner within range knew it. The lead tank was knocked out, and that finished the operation because a broken tank on a raised road with swamp on both sides blocked everything behind it. The next one nosed off the edge, trying to get around, and sank. The one behind that stopped, and so did the one behind that. 6 tanks ended up piled into each other in one spot, and the German artillery destroyed them one after another. Most of the crews were killed or wounded, and none of the tanks sent up that day were recovered. The wrecks were now blocking the only supply road to the men in front, so a salvage party went out night after night under shellfire to blow up their own tanks with gun cotton, and it took about a week to clear the road. No tank was used in the Ypres sector again. One of the tanks left at Polkapelle became a stop for British families visiting the battlefields in the 1920s, and it stayed there until 1941. The messages that reached 2nd Army headquarters from the 9th of October were the early ones, sent while a few units genuinely had got forward, before the German counterattacks took the ground off them again. The cable was cut and the runners weren't getting through, so nothing later arrived to correct them. Plumer read those reports and concluded that a good enough jumping-off line had been taken on the ridge, and he passed that up to Haig as fact. On the evening of the 9th, with the wounded from that morning still lying out on the slope, they planned the next attack. That attack went in on the 12th of October at 5:25 in the morning, in drizzle that turned to driving rain. The New Zealand Division was sent at Bellevue Spur, and the wire there was uncut because the guns were still too far back to reach it. So the New Zealanders arrived at a belt of intact German wire on an open slope in front of pillboxes, and they had to bunch up at the gaps to get through, which is what the German machine guns had been positioned for. The fire came at them from the front and from both flanks at once. Men who reached the wire were shot on it, and men who didn't were pinned in water-filled shell holes for the rest of the day, where anybody who lifted his head was hit. 843 New Zealanders are officially recorded as dying on the 12th of October, most of them inside the first 4 hours, out of somewhere around 2,700 casualties. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, an order came down for another attack on the same ground, and it was cancelled at the last moment. The wounded stayed out on the slope. Getting them back took days, and it only worked because the Germans stopped shooting at the stretcher parties and let them work. A lot of men died out there before anybody reached them. General Godley, the Corps commander, then wrote to the New Zealand Minister of Defence and described the 12th of October as, quote, "a very good day's work." He didn't mention the uncut wire or the failed barrage, and he described the casualties as not unduly heavy. He sent the same account to Haig and to Plumer. 6 days later, the Anzac Corps was pulled out of the line and the Canadians were brought up to take the village. The Canadian Corps commander was Arthur Currie, and when he was told what his men were being sent to do, he said the place wasn't worth it and that the Germans could keep it and rot in the mud. He also told Haig what it was going to cost, which he put at 16,000 Canadian casualties. He was overruled, and the final figure came out at 15,654, so he'd been wrong by about 2%. What he did do was refuse to attack until the ground behind him would carry one. His diary on the 17th of October says the battlefield looks bad, that no salvage had been done and very few of the dead had been buried. So for 2 weeks his engineers and pioneers built. In the Canadian Corps area alone, they laid over 2 miles of double plank road and more than 4,000 yards of tram line. And they did it out in the open, in full view of the ridge, with German gunners watching them work. Hundreds were killed or wounded, building the road they were then going to attack up. On the 21st of October, a single shell landed in the middle of a platoon of the 123rd Canadian Pioneers near the Ypres railway station and killed 20 of them at once, and all 20 are buried side by side. And the ground they were laying that plank over had the dead in it, men and horses both, from the attacks that had already failed there, because nobody had been able to get them out. The attacks went in on the 26th of October, the 30th, the 6th of November, and the 10th. 4 set pieces, each one a short bite with the guns doing most of the work, which is Plumer's method again, except now it was being run off the roads Currie had built. On the 6th of November, the 27th Battalion from Winnipeg went through what was left of the village. Only there was no village, no houses, no church, no streets, just a slightly raised patch of brick dust and mud with a name on the map, and the men standing on it couldn't tell it apart from the rest of the ground. Now the people who actually lived there. Passchendaele before the war was a working Flemish farming village, a church, a few streets and the farms around it, and its people had been cleared out early in the war and had been living somewhere else behind German lines for 3 years. So the people whose houses and fields all of this was being fought over never saw any of it happen. They came back to a map reference, and they rebuilt on it, which is why there are farms on that ground today, and why those farms are still turning up shells and bodies, which we will come to. So what did the whole thing cost? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the people who've spent careers on it don't agree with each other. The figures you'll see most often now are something like 275,000 British Empire casualties and about 200,000 German. But that's one set of numbers out of many. Across the sources, the British total runs anywhere from 240,000 up to 448,000, and the German from 217,000 up to 400,000. So on both sides, the high estimate is close to double the low one. Part of the reason is that the two armies weren't counting the same thing. German returns generally left out the lightly wounded, the men who were patched up and stayed with their units, while the British counted every man who went through a medical unit. And then James Edmonds, the British official historian, decided the German figures were therefore too low and added about 30% to them himself, which is where a lot of the higher German numbers in older books come from. So when somebody gives you a confident figure for Passchendaele, what they've really given you is a choice of assumptions, and there are several to choose from. Then there is what the ridge turned out to be worth. In March 1918, the Germans launched their spring offensive. In April, they came at Flanders, and the Passchendaele salient, which was a narrow finger of ground poking into their lines, became a place you could get cut off in. So Plumer ordered it given up. The withdrawal began on the night of the 15th of April 1918, and the Germans walked back into Passchendaele on the 16th. 100 days of fighting and 250,000 casualties, handed back in about 2 days without a battle for it, by the same command that had insisted on taking it. The ground was retaken at the end of September that year in a matter of days and at a fraction of the cost, once the German army was coming apart on its own. And then the missing. Something like 42,000 bodies were never recovered from this battle at all, and about 90,000 were never identified. And both of those are estimates rather than counts, because you can't precisely count the thing you're describing. The Menin Gate at Ypres carries 54,896 names of men with no known grave, and the memorial wall at Tyncott carries nearly another 35,000. Those two cover the whole salient across the whole war rather than this battle on its own, and the only reason there are two of them is that the names wouldn't fit fit on one building, so they picked a cut-off date of the 15th of August 1917 and carried the rest on at the other site. At Tyncott itself, of the roughly 12,000 graves, more than 7 in 10 have no name on them. And the reason this battle in particular did that to men comes straight out of what you already know about the ground. Shells landing in liquid mud bury whatever they hit. Wounded men went down into water-filled holes and stayed there, and every square yard of it was shelled again and again for 3 months. So a man who got buried once was dug up and buried again by the next barrage. For a body to get a name, it has to be found, and it has to still be identifiable. And this ground was very good at making sure that neither of those happened, which raises the question of who was sent out to look for them afterwards. During the war, the British recruited around 96,000 Chinese laborers, most of them farmers from Shandong, into what was called the Chinese Labor Corps. And the contracts they signed promised rear area work away from the fighting. That's not what a lot of them got. They were kept in fenced camps under guard. They were identified by numbers rather than by their names. And when the war ended, they weren't sent home. They were kept on to clear the battlefields, which meant lifting unexploded shells out of the ground and digging up the dead and reburying them in the cemeteries you can go and stand in today. One of them, Gu Jingjing, wrote afterwards that the English had to be dug up in order to be buried. Nearly 2,000 of them died in Europe, and the last of them didn't get home until 1920. One last thing about how we came to picture this battle the way we do. The Australian official photographer at Ypres was Frank Hurley, and his photographs are the ones that get used whenever anybody illustrates this battle. Some of the most famous of them aren't photographs of anything. Hurley built them in the darkroom out of several negatives, dropping aircraft into a sky that hadn't had any, or an explosion behind men who had been photographed somewhere else entirely. His argument was that a modern battle is simply too big to fit onto one plate. He'd tried to do it straight, and in his own words, the results are hopeless. So a composite was the only way to show somebody at home what the thing actually looked like. Charles Bean, the Australian official historian, called them fakes and said, quote, "We will not have them at any price." His argument was that a photograph is a record, that people a century later would come to these pictures to find out what happened, and that putting things into them which weren't there is lying to us. They fought about it from late September 1917 onwards. Hurley threatened to resign over it, and it ended in a compromise where he was allowed 6 composites in an exhibition. The awkward part is that both of them were right, because the composites do give you the feel of the place, and they're also not evidence. And they're what most people have in their heads when they picture Passchendaele. The ground itself hasn't finished either. Around 1.5 billion shells were fired on the Western Front, and somewhere between a quarter and a third of them failed to go off. And in Flanders, they went into soft clay that closed over them and preserved them. So they keep coming back up. The Belgian Army's disposal unit, DOVO, collects roughly 200 to 250 tons of unexploded munitions every year, most of it surfacing in the spring planting and the autumn ploughing when the machinery reaches down far enough to find it. Farmers stack them at the edge of the field for collection, and shells sitting by a field gate are an ordinary sight on the roads between Ypres and Passchendaele. A share of them are chemical shells, and mustard doesn't decay into anything harmless. So a shell filled with it in 1917 is still full of it now, inside a steel casing that has been rusting for over 100 years. Since the armistice, somewhere around 360 people have been killed by this in the Ypres area and over 500 injured. And it isn't only farmers, because 2 construction workers were killed in Ypres itself in 2014 when they hit a shell digging on a building site. DOVO has lost 23 of its own men doing the job. And the dead are still coming up as well. A farmer plows a little deeper than usual, or a builder digs foundations for a house, and there are bones. Sometimes there are buttons and boot nails and a shoulder title lying in the soil beside them. And now and then there's enough left to put a name back onto a man who's been one of the 90,000 for a century. It happens most years. He gets reburied in one of the cemeteries with a service, and if he's been identified, his family gets told 4 or 5 generations on. That's the part of this battle that's still running.